from the Toulouse School of Economics.
And narrative.
And I'm sorry we don't have all the titles on abstracts for next quarter up yet. People have been really slow to get them to us. But we're starting off with Joan Silk the first week. And she'll get us a title soon, I'm sure, dermatologist. And we have some other really great talks. David Blanca, Mike Gervin, for example. From EEB, Morgan Tingley, who hasn't talked here before. And some of our own recent and current PhD students who are giving their swan song talk for us. So I want to thank our funders, UCLA Dean of Social Sciences, also the Departments of Anthropology and Communication, and private donors. And now let's turn this over to Olympia, who is, by the way, going to be here for a couple more days. So if you were too shy to sign up for an individual appointment, we get very excited about her talk. There is hope. You can come talk to her both after this talk, during coffee, and later.
Thanks. Well, thanks for having me. My name's Olympia. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Toulouse, which is a kind of interdisciplinary institute, part of an economics university. And there's a small kind of subgroup of anthropologists, psychologists, political scientists, but that's where I'm based now. And today I'm going to be presenting kind of two projects that I've been working on. And they are the relationship between cousin marriage and women's welfare and also reproductive success. And the first half will be on women's welfare. What I'm really talking about there is I'm going to focus on intimate partner violence and coercive control over women. And then the second half will tackle the kind of evolutionary puzzle-ish of cousin marriage by looking at reproductive success. But before we get into that, I'd like to stress that this isn't an obscure behavior. Kin marriage is really, really common across humans. So pharaohs married their cousins, but also their sisters and their half-sisters. Albert Einstein's second wife was his first cousin on his maternal side and his second cousin on his paternal side. The Roman politician Mark Antony, one of his first wives was his first cousin. And then very well known is Darwin was married to his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. It's also not just a practice that the kind of rich and important do either. So this is a map, which is a mess and confusing, but it's all the societies in the ethnographic atlas for which cousin marriage is coded. And across sort of 1,000 societies, small-scale societies, about 46% of them permit cousin marriage. And the key here, which is very confusing, I'll just draw your attention only to the red and the pale green. Those are the societies that don't permit it. So those are predominantly in North America, Central Africa, and Europe. Then you have this band across North Africa and the Middle East, and in the Pacific, where many different types of cousin marriage are permitted and often preferred. And lastly, it's also not a historical practice. It's very common today. This is a map put together by Alan Bittles, drawing lots of different data sources of varying quality. But putting it all together, data from sort of 1950 to today, looking at where in the world practices a lot of cousin marriage. Here he's defining it as a second cousin or closer. And you see there's a real hotspot. There's missing data for sub-Saharan Africa, but there's a real hotspot across North Africa, the Middle East, and through into South Asia and South India. You have regions and countries here that are hitting like 30, 40% of all marriages being between second cousins or closer. So it's very, very common. Despite it being so common, we also know that there are well-known health consequences of marrying kin. The strength of these health consequences is debatable, but we do know they exist, and these include things like a greater load of deleterious mutations, lower fertility amongst the offspring of kin marriage, increased rates of childhood mortality, and even an increased mortality across the life course. That's actually an economic historian using data from the United States. And there's also evidence of possibly delayed development. This is research from the UK, which shows that the offspring of cousin married couples are behind on their reading ability by sort of three to 4 months. It's very, very confounded by poverty. These are very deprived communities, so it's difficult to tease out the actual effect of cousin marriage. And then the picture there is Charles II of Spain, the Habsburgs, very famous for how inbred their lineage was, and they developed this jutting jaw, and it eventually led to the demise of that lineage. In fact, the health effects of cousin marriage have been known for a long time, and actually Darwin wanted cousin marriage tracked in the census, and he was quite tormented that the ill health of his children was maybe a product of his marriage. So he wrote to his friend who was in the Houses of Parliament, asking him to propose that a question on cousin marriage is added to the census, saying, in England and many parts of Europe, the marriages of cousins are objected to from their supposed injurious consequences, but this belief rests on no direct evidence. So it's therefore manifestly desirable that it should either be proved false or confirmed. So that in this latter case, the marriages of cousins might be discouraged. And just to round out this little anecdote, he was laughed out of Parliament. They said, no, we're not going to ask him about it. So he set his son the task of figuring it out. And his son went around the UK in asylums, seeing if the offspring of cousin married individuals were overrepresented. He couldn't find anything convincing, but the only thing that made him kind of pause and think, okay, maybe cousin marriage is bad, is that amongst the rowing teams of Oxford and Cambridge, which for him were like the kind of pinnacle of like the fittest men, the sons of first cousin parents did appear slightly less frequently than they might have been expected, given how many existed in the population. And so after that, he was like, okay, maybe it's a bad thing. 100 years later, over 100 years later, the question and the debate on cousin marriage has actually returned, and it's returned to lots of European parliaments. In the UK, we have a member of parliament who's proposed a ban on cousin marriage in the UK, and he says there are 3 real issues at stake. These are health, freedom, and our national values. Freedom here, he's really referring to the freedom of women. Matthew Said, who's a journalist writing for the Sunday Times, also very anti-cousin marriage, says it's a practice that is damaging not only to societies but to the communities themselves, particularly women. These are not arguments made necessarily in good faith. They are anti-Muslim dog whistles, and they are very anti-immigration, and cousin marriage in the UK is predominantly occurring in immigrant communities, principally Pakistani ones. But regardless of that, they are framing it, both in the health consequences and also in this new idea that it's bad for women, that it restricts their freedom. It's not just the UK, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have all put forward bans. Some of them have gone into effect in these countries. So, given this kind of broad background, I kind of think 2 questions are raised, or a question and a puzzle. The first is a societal outcomes question, which is cousin marriage detrimental to women, as these individuals are framing it? And the second one is an evolutionary puzzle, which is if the existence of fitness costs are broadly accepted, why do humans marry kin so frequently? And I'll focus on the first question in the first half and the second question in the second half. So part 1, what might the effect of cousin marriage be on women's welfare? Empirically, it's quite hard to answer this question. Also, what does women's welfare really mean? So we're going to focus on pretty objective measures for which we have data, which is domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and then also coercive control, so whether her movements are limited by her husband and her family. And I'm going to propose 2 kind of competing hypotheses on what the effect of cousin marriage might be. And the first one is the protection hypothesis. And this is the idea that both evolutionary and non-evolutionary social scientists will often converge on, which is that a woman's proximity to her own biological kin should be protective against intimate partner violence. From an evolutionary perspective, we know that kin-based cooperation is kind of foundational to conflict and altruism, and that you're more likely to be cooperative towards your kin. So if you're separated from your kin, you're more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. And that's a very foundational idea in the evolution of patriarchy that started off in primatology and has now been extended to humans. But it's also kind of, it's understandable anyway that you want to be around your social network. And also in practice, women will often turn to their natal family automatically in situations of abuse. They're the first people that they turn to. And empirically, there's a lot of evidence that women's status increases when they remain near their kin. So women in patrilocal populations, where women are moving to their husband's home, work harder than those in matrilocal populations. So there's evidence of that they're kind of being exploited. That's data from China. Women in matrilocal populations exhibit lower hypertension and inflammation than their patrilocal counterparts. So when they are near their natal kin, they appear to be less stressed. And then there's work from economics which shows that women in matrilineal populations actually experience less domestic violence and have greater autonomy in decision making. And that paper is quite a nice causal design. I also forgot to mention, I'm really happy to be interrupted with questions if you have clarification questions. So how does cousin marriage specifically relate to this literature? Well, obviously, cousin marriage will increase proximity to kin through the marriage tie itself, and that will happen regardless of residence rule. So if she marries her cousin on her father's side, well, she marries her mother's brother's son, she's near her maternal uncles. She marries her father's brother's son, she's near her paternal uncles, and so on and so forth. It also increases the relatedness of the husband as well, because they're cousins to each other. So what it's really doing is probably reducing the sex-based inequality in relatedness, in relatedness to the group, or how many relatives you're surrounded by. So now, thinking about the mechanisms that might link close kin to protection is through the fact that it probably sets up, or might set up, relationships of accountability. And so what I mean by this is that when husband and wife are linked through family in common, then those kin that are around you can hold men accountable for mistreating their wives. And the important thing is that they may actually have authority, recognized authority to do this. So if my father is also my husband's uncle, that's actually a relationship that often has, that senior man often has authority over that man. So he can intervene if we're having disputes, and these family members can impose social and reputational costs on the husband for mistreatment. And there is some evidence that this does happen. So earlier work that I did during my PhD did find that, just looking at one country, that women married to their cousins were less likely to report intimate partner violence. And the project I will present is kind of an extension of that paper. But also women in focus groups, when they're asked, why might you marry a cousin, or why would you prefer to marry a cousin, they'll often raise this idea that marrying an unrelated man is kind of uncertain and a bit dangerous, and that marrying a cousin is much safer. We have to remember that this is happening in societies where there's a lot of gender segregation. You're not necessarily meeting men all the time, getting to know them. So getting married is, your husband is potentially quite an unknown quantity. The other way, beyond keeping relatives socially and physically proximate, that cousin marriage might also be protective, is that it just aligns the interests between husband and wife. And when we think about coercion, often we're thinking about coercion in terms of you're behaving in a way that diverges from my interests, so I'm going to coerce you, or I'm going to abuse you to bring you back into line with my own interests. But if we share wealth, if we share family, if we share inheritance because we're kin, maybe we don't disagree that much on many things. And therefore there's just not as much opportunity for conflict within that relationship. So that's a kind of more optimistic mechanism that it might work through. There is also ethnographic and qualitative evidence of this kind of alignment of interests. So cousin wives tend to be trusted more, or at least men express that. So among Egyptian Bedouins, men express that they can trust their father's brother's daughter because they care about you and your things because they are hers. They're aligned, they have the same stuff. This Dyson and Moore paper, which describes cousin marriage in southern India, argues that in marrying women from other groups, so non-kin, means that in some ways she's viewed as a threat and her behavior must be closely watched. She must be re-socialized so that she comes to identify her own interests with those of her husband's kin. Senior family wives tend to dominate the young in-marrying wives. So an unrelated woman is like, she's also an unknown quantity and maybe she's not trusted. So why do others suggest that cousin marriage actually has negative consequences for women? The idea here is that cousin marriage creates kinship-intense societies. Kinship intensity is kind of a woolly concept, but essentially it means societies that tend to have strongly overlapping networks of kin that co-reside in the same community. And that kind of kinship intensity is produced by multiple things, including polygyny, but also kin marriage, because it overlaps your kin. And then the idea is that women are controlled by these very intense kinship networks. And they're under the thumb of their relatives, basically. Again, we have evidence of this in the ethnographic literature. So women can become controlled in terms of reduced marriage choice. So one case quoted in a 10th century Arabic collection of poems and songs describes a father who's scolding his daughter for resisting to marry his brother's son. And he says, he's your uncle's son, and of all men, he has first claim to you. Women can feel controlled by their relatives, unable to state grievances without fear of breaking the family relationship. That's work by Mary Schenk in contemporary Bangladesh. I've forgotten where the final quote is from, but they express this idea that women are forced to compromise on decisions if they're married to cousins. It's usually the related daughter-in-law who makes the compromises. A non-related daughter-in-law will not give such concessions. And then also work that I did during my PhD showed that there's some evidence that cousin marriage is associated with honor cultures. Honor cultures are kind of like the pinnacle of like constraint on women. They tend to contain many rules related to marriage and sex. Women are very strictly controlled. There's a lot of restriction on female personal movement, a lot of seclusion when it gets more extreme. And what we did is we took genetic data from different ethnic groups and created a measure of how much cousin marriage these societies have been practicing. That's along the x-axis, running from low cousin marriage or no cousin marriage to high, and then survey data on the strength of an honor culture. And what we found is that societies that were practicing more cousin marriage had stronger honor cultures. And the argument we were making is that there's kind of parent-offspring conflict over this marriage choice, and then parents or wider kin group enforce it on the offspring via an honor culture. But I'm not going to go too deep into that today. So just to summarize the protection versus constraint kind of hypothesis, the two protection ones are that cousin marriage increases proximity to kin, they have greater recourse to kin-based support, and then a lower risk of IPV and coercive control. The other idea is that cousin marriage just aligns the interests between husband and wife, so there's less opportunity for conflict, so we should observe lower risk of intimate partner violence and control. And then the constraint hypothesis is this idea that actually it embeds the couple in very intense kin networks. Family cohesion is prioritized over individual autonomy, and potentially sort of kin-selected cooperation is offset by more intense competition between relatives, and we have a higher risk of intimate partner violence and coercive control. So now onto the data, and we'll use the same data but more countries for the second half as well. It's demographic health survey data. So for those who don't know it, huge demographic health surveys that collect a whole range of data on many things, and a minority of these data sets also collect information on intimate partner violence and control, and a few of them on cousin marriage. So these are the 4 countries that had data on both cousin marriage and our measures of women's welfare. Our sample size is going to span from around 36,000 to 46,000, so quite large. And the survey years run from 2005 to 2018. Just so you know exactly what the women were asked in these surveys, this is the question they were asked on intimate partner violence. Did your husband ever do any of the following things to you? Push you, shake you, or throw something, slap you, twist your arm or pull your hair, punch you, kick you, drag you, or beat you up, try to choke you or burn you, or threaten or attack you with a weapon. So they increase in severity. And this was, had they ever done any of this? So across the whole marriage, and they could reply yes or no. For coercive control, they asked this. I'm going to ask you about some situations which happen to some women. Please tell me if these apply to your relationship with your husband. He frequently accuses you of being unfaithful. He doesn't permit you to meet your female friends. He tries to limit your contact with your family. And he insists on knowing where you are at all times. So kind of a broad measure of control. This is the raw data on the percentage of marriages that are between, I think this is second cousins and closer, not just first cousins. But I might be wrong, but I forgot it. Oh no, it's first cousin. It's only first cousins. So you can see with birth cohort along the x-axis, so you can see that for Jordan, dramatically, but also a bit for Egypt and Turkey, we have declining cousin marriage rates across the period, and Pakistan is just completely different. It's just rapidly increasing. It's unclear kind of why. Jordan goes through quite dramatic fall in their fertility rate during that period, and whether or not you can marry a cousin is extremely sensitive to fertility rate. As soon as you reduce the fertility rate, you simply don't have a cousin of appropriate age and appropriate sex for you to marry. So it's just a big limiter on it. That doesn't happen to Pakistan. Pakistan also doesn't economically develop in the same way as those other countries, and that's also a key driver for a reduction in cousin marriage. This is the raw data on the number of women who report any form of intimate partner violence. So they said yes to any of those types of violence. And we also see a steady decline across the 3 countries, not Turkey. We don't have intimate partner violence for Turkey, across that period. For coercive control, we also see a decline, but it's kind of less, well, it's slightly less obvious. And Pakistan has the lowest number of women reporting coercive control. And I can't explain that for you. Before we get into the analysis, I'm just going to outline some of the main issues with testing this hypothesis with this data, and then I'm going to try and convince you that I tackle them later on to varying degrees of success. The main one is reporting bias. So we know that all women tend to underreport intimate partner violence. We don't really care if cousin married and non-cousin married women underreport at the same level. It doesn't really matter to us so much. We really care if they underreport at different rates, and that might be happening because cousin married women may simply not want to report on their family. They don't want to upset that family relationship, and they just don't want to implicate close relatives. So that is an issue that kind of just continually runs through it. But one way that I tackle this is by comparing intimate partner violence to coercive control. And I make the argument, which is fairly convincing, which is that coercive control is subject to less underreporting. It has different disclosure dynamics. It's not so stigmatized. Often women will, when they do report coercive control, never consider it as a form of abuse or that they're a victim, so they're much more comfortable reporting it, which is not the case for intimate partner violence. So if we see the same result between the two types, we can kind of say, okay, we don't think that underreporting is driving the whole intimate partner violence result. And then I'm also going to compare cousin marriage types, but I'll go into that when I get there. The second main issue is that there is selection into cousin marriage. So women who marry cousins are simply different from those who don't. So cousin marrying families just have different set of norms that govern marital behavior, or they're more traditional, or they're more conservative, and that's kind of driving any difference that we see. And the way that I'm going to address that mostly is through cluster fixed effects. I'm also going to balance the sample on observables, so just like match the sample so they're not different in the distribution of confounding variables. And I'm also going to control for parental cousin marriage. So for Turkey, we also know whether the parents were married to a cousin. So that controls for that kind of family environment, or at least controls for this idea that cousin married families are just different. Before I move on to the next slide, which is the first set of results, I will just explain this more. So when the Demographic Health Survey go out and collect their data, they go to primary sampling units, which are essentially neighborhoods of a maximum of 250 households, which is kind of usually the size of a village or smaller. Then they randomly select 25 or 30 households, and then they'll interview one woman per household for intimate partner violence. We know what neighborhood they're living in, not like actually, but we know the number of that cluster. If you include that in the model, you essentially control for all unobservable confounding at that neighborhood level. So by including them, we can control for like the geographic patterning of poverty, we can control for the geographic patterning of ethnic group, and so that gets rid of quite a lot of confounding, because it's essentially like you're controlling for the neighborhood and you're only comparing women within that same cluster to each other. So this is the first set of results where the outcome is the top bar is any intimate partner violence. On the left-hand side, you have the point estimate, and on the right-hand side, the prevalence, so just how many women in the sample reported that type of violence. I know it's a binomial outcome, but when you use sort of thousands of fixed effects, you use a linear probability model, but it's fine. And I checked the robustness of that. So being married to a cousin is associated with a 2.1% lower likelihood, lower probability of reporting any form of intimate partner violence. Not huge, but there. That's actually because the base level of reporting intimate partner violence for non-cousin married women is a bit higher than 22.4. It's like 23 or 24. That actually corresponds to a 9% relative reduction to non-consanguineously married women. So it's a considerable reduction in the number of women who report intimate partner violence. All the models are controlling for wealth, education, husband's education, year of birth, age difference between husband and wife as well. Then I also run the models again with each item individually to see if it's being driven by any singular item or if it holds for all items. And it holds for every single item as you go from less severe to more severe. Obviously, the effect size becomes extremely small because these are very rare events when you get to very severe types of violence. But it seems to be that cousin married women are certainly reporting less violence. Now for coercive control, same type of graph, with the addition of Turkey now, women are kind of 3% less likely to report any form of coercive control. And that corresponds to about an 8% reduction relative to non-consanguineous women. The fact that that number is very consistent with the relative reduction for intimate partner violence, kind of implies that we're not necessarily just picking up a different pattern in underreporting, because the relative reduction is the same, consistent with kind of cousin married women genuinely receiving less coercive control and less intimate partner violence. Again, breaking it down into its items, it's significant across all items apart from accusations of infidelity, which is kind of a different style of question, I think, compared to the other ones, which are very much to do with limiting contact and insisting on knowing where the person is. Cool. This is only to mention Models 2 in both panels is what you just saw on the other graph. Model 1 is without the cluster fixed effects. And Model 3 is with when you match on observables. The only thing that is kind of interesting here is, so when you move from Model 1 to Model 2, you're controlling for all that neighborhood unobserved confounding. And you'll see that the point estimate for intimate partner violence doesn't change much as you move from Model 1 to 2. It goes from minus 0.025 to minus 0.021. That's not the case for controlling behavior, where it goes from minus 0.05 to minus 0.029. So what that's showing is that controlling behavior is much more sensitive to like local norms or the local environment than intimate partner violence is, which is just kind of interesting. And then the final column is where I matched on all these observables, just to show that the results are not being driven by the fact that cousin married women are predominantly poorer or something like that. The final thing that we can also do is we can break down by cousin marriage type to try and probe the mechanisms that's linking cousin marriage to this potential reduction in intimate partner violence and coercive control. This is the raw data, looking at the percentage of women who are married to a patrilateral first cousin, that's a first cousin on the father's side, or a matrilateral one, or a second or more distant or unrelated. And what you can see is that across these 4 countries, patrilateral first is preferred to a matrilateral first. They're preferentially marrying on their father's side. All these contexts are quite patriarchal, and descent and the type of relative that bears more weight is relatives on the father's side. So you might expect that when you marry a cousin on that side, they have more authority over your husband. So we might see a different effect on the reporting intimate partner violence if you break it down by cousin marriage type. And that is indeed what we see for physical intimate partner violence. So the orange is intimate partner violence and the blue is controlling behavior. And the y-axis is the predicted probability from the model, like averaged over the entire distribution of observables. And what you find, looking at the orange line, is that a patrilateral cousin has the lowest probability of reporting violence, a bit higher for matrilateral, and then a second or more distant, it's basically the same probability as being married to an unrelated individual. That pattern kind of suggests either that they're underreporting more than them, which is possible, or it suggests that being married to a cousin on your father's side is more protective because that is a more important cousin. You don't see this for controlling behavior. You see a big difference between first cousins and second or unrelated. That's where the big jump is. But there's no difference in your probability of reporting controlling behavior if you're married to a cousin on the father's or mother's side. One way you can interpret this is that if controlling behavior is or if policing and monitoring is distributed across relatives, so her behavior is now monitored by her aunts and her cousins and whoever, it doesn't matter which side you marry on. Those relatives are equally able to monitor her behavior, in which case the husband can take a step back and not do such oppressive type of monitoring of limiting her movements and freedom. And that also kind of speaks to this more like abstract point or discussive point, which is that we shouldn't necessarily take the fact that they're reporting less control as evidence of like unequivocal freedom. It's just that the form and locus of policing and monitoring might have changed. She genuinely does have greater freedom of movement, though, so there is some freedom, but she still might be constrained for other reasons. And the final thing for this project is to control for parental consanguinity. So this is the idea that this association could reflect family characteristics that are just common among households that practice cousin marriage, rather than mechanisms that are activated by the cousin marriage tie itself. So this is only Turkey, where we have data for parents' cousin marriage. That's the point estimate on just coercive control. And then we control for whether her parents are first cousins or whether his parents are first cousins. It doesn't affect the point estimate at all, doesn't reduce it. So those kind of family level norms don't appear to be driving this. And also it's just not independently associated with these outcomes either. So it's probably not being driven by family culture, although we can't 100% disentangle it by this, but it implies that it's not. So that's kind of the end of that first project. And the kind of takeaways from it is that women married to their cousins do appear to be less likely to report domestic violence and controlling behavior, but both these mechanisms remain plausible. So it could be because they have greater recourse to kin-based support, or it could be that their interests are more aligned, and we can't really do anything with this data to really tease those two things apart, although breaking it down by cousin marriage type is informative towards that in the ways that I've just described. But yeah, so that's the first bit kind of done. And the second, does anyone have any questions for the first bit? Should I just keep going? So the second half now is going to tackle, which is much more recent work. It's neither of these papers are published. The first one is revise and resubmit, but this one hasn't even been submitted yet. So it's very new. Critique it as you wish, because it's all changeable. But here I'm tackling this idea that if cousin marriage has known fitness costs, why do humans engage in it so frequently? So this is a slightly more evolutionary side to this talk, and we're really going to be looking at reproductive success here. Yes?
I did have a question. I just thought, for the first part of your analysis, did you do any sort of analysis by countries? So to look at heterogeneity across your 4 countries, especially because Pakistan, you said, had nearly 50%.
Yeah, so I break it. I didn't put it in the slides, and it's also not in the appendix. I did run it again, just by individual country, and it's robust to doing that. The only one that actually is a bit iffy is Egypt. So Egypt kind of, the effect size becomes pretty small to almost be not interesting. But otherwise it holds across the other countries. Okay, cool, yeah. So if cousin marriage has known fitness costs, why do humans engage in it? So one of the main kind of reasons that would be put forward in evolutionary biology is obviously that cousin marriage has inclusive fitness benefits. So by marrying your cousin, to whom you're 25% related, have I got that wrong? No. Then you help him reproduce. And then you have more genes in the gene pool in future generations. And actually, there's kind of a calculation that gets quoted quite a lot in the inbreeding literature, which is that the inbreeding cost has to be quite severe to offset any kind of inclusive fitness benefits. So even mating with a brother with whom you're 50% related, your offspring have to be less viable by about 1/3 to offset those inbreeding costs. That's in a kind of hypothetical population. Inbreeding tolerance drops very quickly if you have biparental care. If by mating with or reproducing with your kin, you prevent them from reproducing with unrelated individuals. So if you're monogamous, for example, then your inbreeding tolerance drops. But in a species where you could just reproduce with kin and then you could wander off and reproduce with anyone else, inbreeding cost has to be very high to offset that inclusive fitness benefit. And this kind of idea has led to people looking a lot more amongst all animals as to whether we've actually assumed that inbreeding intolerance is much more common than it is. And the animals highlighted in red at the top are ones where empirically there is inbreeding intolerance. They avoid kin. For orange ones, or yellow ones, they actually tolerate quite a great deal of inbreeding, and often in animal studies you're looking at inbreeding between siblings, you're not looking at anything less related than that. And amongst the fish, which I can't remember what kind of fish, there's actually a preference towards inbreeding. So, and this is all framed to be because of the inclusive fitness benefits. Among humans, you then have obviously an extra layer of benefits. So we have and these benefits are wealth and search-related benefits. So we saw the royal families and the rich, important people at the beginning, and that's because cousin marriage obviously has wealth consolidation and political power benefits. You consolidate wealth within those families, and they become more powerful. And obviously this might go on to have reproductive benefits. They might be more reproductively successful. But it's not only among extremely wealthy individuals, because cousin marriage also reduces other types of costs of marriage, which are dowry and bride price and search costs. So often among individuals marrying kin, they avoid all types of marital payment. Either it's much lower or it's completely non-existent. So there's a lot of money saved there. The other thing that it does is it reduces search costs. So if it's kin, you don't have to engage in the lengthy process of vetting a possible partner. You already know what they're like, you know their family reputation, you know their character, you know their health, all these kinds of things, which means that you can go into that marriage much quicker than you would otherwise be able to. And so because of that, we might expect, or I have hypothesized, that age at marriage and age at first birth is going to be lower because you have accelerated family formation. When, you can't read this, but in focus groups, when you ask individuals, again, why they marry their cousins, they do raise those things. So they say a cousin is already known familiar, you don't have to split inherited property, there's lower dowry payment, or there's even no dowry payment to the household. So they're like major reasons why people engage in cousin marriage. And then, as we mentioned before, there are health consequences. I'm not going to go through them again, but that's our evolutionary puzzle. You might have thought that there's one crucial characteristic of these costs and benefits, which is that they operate at different levels, or they kind of diverge. So the costs are entirely borne by the individual couple who are marrying and reproducing together. They're the ones who have the children that might suffer from inbreeding depression. But the benefits, the economic and social benefits, such as wealth consolidation, et cetera, accrue to the entire household or the extended family. So it's not really a fair split, or at least there's divergence. And because of that, we can kind of ask the following question. If household or extended family benefits exceed the individual level inbreeding cost, then consanguineous marriage could be maintained by inclusive fitness even when it's costly to the individual couple through those diversified benefits. The other implication of it, though, is that this divergence might actually just produce a lot of parent-offspring conflict or family-offspring conflict over that marriage choice, because the wider family wants the wealth consolidation, but they themselves don't want to be the one who has to marry their cousin. So what I'm going to do in this analysis, which is different from the other one, is I'm going to try and decompose the fitness outcomes across different levels. I'm going to decompose it from the individual, the household, and then also the neighborhood, the cluster. And we're going to look at 4 different outcomes that kind of constitute a sort of fitness balance sheet, which is the age at marriage, the age at first birth. We're going to see if we can detect inbreeding costs through under 5 childhood mortality. And then we're going to look at completed fertility and see if the earlier age at marriage could potentially offset the child mortality. So you end up with net equal completed fertility or potentially higher. And then the analysis is going to do what I've just said, is decompose these across the individual household and neighborhood. And so we're going to use a different type of model, and we're going to use a random effects model within between approach. So this is akin to a fixed effects model in that it controls for that unobserved confounding at those higher levels, but it also allows you to estimate associations between the higher levels and outcomes. So the way that this is done is you calculate a mean, a consanguinity mean for a household. How many members of that household are married to their cousins? How many members of the community are married to their cousin? And that allows you to see whether more consanguinity in a house also might influence age at marriage or completed fertility. So it allows you to kind of partition these things. The reason that I didn't do that for the last one is when you ask them questions about intimate partner violence, they only ask one woman. But on the less stigmatized questions, they will interview a number of women within the household. So you get some within household variation. Yeah. Same data, 2 more countries, Morocco and India. A much, much bigger sample size because many more women are interviewed on these particular topics. And like I said, for a minority of the sample, we have multiple women interviewed per household. It's not a huge number of women. Often at times it's like 2 to 4, and the majority of households actually still just 1 woman, and they get lost from the sample when we do that within between approach. This is the raw data for age at marriage across the 6 countries. Orange is when you're married to kin. This is defined here as any type of kin, second cousin, first cousin, anything. And the green is unrelated. And what you see is that they're consistently marrying earlier than individuals married to non-kin, and that the gap in all these countries remains quite constant as age at marriage increases over time across all these countries as well. So first look, it does seem that they're marrying earlier. Of course, this could again be driven by the fact that these are predominantly poorer households or more conservative traditional households. So these are the table results for age at marriage, and I'll walk through them quite slowly. The first row is without the household mean, so we don't get the reduction in sample size from limiting it to households where more than 1 woman was interviewed. What you find is that if you're married to kin, you marry about half a year earlier than non-kin individuals, so about 6 months earlier. You also have an association with the neighborhood. So if you're in a neighborhood with lots of consanguinity, you also get married earlier. That point estimate is looking at a change from a 0% region to a 100% region. So it's kind of inflated because you wouldn't necessarily move there, but it constitutes, you can just divide it. So moving from a cluster with 0% consanguinity to 25% is associated with marrying 2.5 months earlier. So that's probably just picking up community level norms around age at marriage. But even while controlling for that, we still have the individual level effect association. This now adds the household mean. So we have the reduction in sample size, which also might mean that you're now looking at a different kind of household, because a different kind of household, probably maybe a poorer one, is more likely to have extended family living there. So when you go to a household with with more than 1 woman interviewed, that could be happening. So you're slightly comparing apples and oranges, but maybe not. I need to just check the distribution of the observables. And what you find now, because this also controls for the household environment, So this coefficient is now essentially saying, okay, comparing women within the same household, one married to a kin member, the other one not, they're still marrying 0.35 of the year earlier, so about 4 months earlier, and the household level consanguinity is not independently associated with it. So this earlier age at marriage does appear to be a feature of the individual match and the reduced search costs, rather than a result of the household context. We can then do it for age at first birth. Does this earlier age at marriage then correspond to an earlier age at first birth? And it does. So it is associated with a 5-month earlier age at first birth. Again, living in a community, a more conservative or traditional community, they're also having earlier age at first birth. And like age at marriage, again, it's a so controlling for the household environment does attenuate it about halves it, but it's not independently associated, so it does appear to be a feature of the match and a feature of this earlier age at marriage, which allows transition into first birth quicker than other individuals. Now looking at childhood mortality, colours have flipped. Unrelated marriages have a lower under 5 childhood mortality across every single country. So again, in the raw data, we do appear to be picking up maybe some kind of inbreeding cost, or at least differences in wealth and healthcare. We run the same type of model again, but now we're looking at an odds ratio instead, because whether or not a child dies is binomial. And what we find is that being married to kin is associated with an 18% increase in under 5 mortality. So there does seem to be a cost of marrying kin, and also living in an area where lots of kin marriages going on, which again is probably picking up something else about the areas. What that kind of corresponds to is what I've written in the second bullet point. So the baseline under 5 mortality among non-consanguineous women is about 43 per 1,000 live births. Consanguinity raises this to 51, so you get an additional 8 deaths per 1,000. I'm not entirely sure whether, I've been thinking about whether I consider that to be a big increase or not. This is obviously a very extreme outcome, so it's rare. So any increase is actually kind of big, because under 5 mortality doesn't happen that often, or it's a rare event. So I think it is considerable. Obviously, with a sample size that big, everything's going to be significant. So we have to think about the effect size a bit more. When you add the household mean, we attenuate that association in line with the fact that there is household context there that is going to affect childhood mortality. So we now reduce it from 8 additional deaths to just 5 additional deaths per 1,000 live births, and the household consanguinity is not associated with it. So this, which is what we'd expect if this under 5 mortality is being driven by inbreeding costs, is that it is a function of that individual match and not of the household context. One additional thing that they can do to kind of really convince you of that is that you can break it down by an additional gradient. So what I did is broke down kin marriage by your actual relatedness to your husband. So in green is unrelated, and these are the predicted under 5 deaths per 1,000 live births. The middle orange bar is if you're married to distant kin, which is defined as a second cousin or more distant, so you're not as related to them. And then the dark orange is close kin, so that's a first cousin or closer. By closer here, I mean the uncle-niece marriages that happen in India as well. Did you have a question?
Have you considered, in your previous analysis, you had the additional layer of if the parents of the current couple were also a close marriage, would you be able to add that in as another level for this?
I really need to do that, and I need to do that for Turkey, and it's a really good point, and I haven't done that yet. But certainly. that would definitely drive home that point. But yeah, what you see here is there's no reason necessarily why you would see that kind of dose response apart from the fact that it's being driven by you're more closely related to that individual, so the inbreeding cost is higher. So the last thing I'm just going to show you is the completed fertility. So there is a considerable under 5 mortality, so maybe the earlier age at marriage, which once you control for the household context wasn't actually that much, doesn't help out. And what you find with completed fertility, so here the sample is reduced to women who are completed or at near completion, so only women aged over 40. So our sample size is lower. And what you find when you don't add the household effect, is you get a slight positive association between individual kin marriage and completed fertility. So this constitutes to, per 100 kin married women, there are 5 more surviving children, or rather 1 child per 20 consanguineous women compared to non. And the community level association also exists. So you get 1 additional surviving child for every 5 women when you move to a 25% proportion of women in the neighborhood. But the interesting thing that happens here is when you add the household mean. The sign on that coefficient switches. So once you control for the household context, the kin married women are actually coming out with fewer children. And you get a slight positive association on the household mean. And so this, again, I'm really struggling to translate it into sort of meaningful numbers, basically means that if you had a household with 4 women in it, and 2 of them married kin, so you move from a 0% to a 50% household, this would yield approximately 0.2 extra children. Then you can times that by 5, and you get 1 extra child for every 5 such households. So again, it's modest, but it's interesting that you get this divergence in fertility outcomes. And potentially it hints at this idea that these benefits are accruing to the wider household while this cost is being borne by the individual couple. That's kind of what I'm trying to show with this. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts on whether I successfully do that. So I'm going to wrap up, and I think I'm really on time, which is great, on this section, which is that in this data set, we've kind of shown that kin married women do marry and start having children earlier. And so they might get a longer reproductive period, which should increase their completed fertility. But we've also detected fairly significant inbreeding costs on a very rare outcome as well. So we don't know what the inbreeding costs on a less rare outcome or less easily detectable outcome is. So you get higher infant and child mortality and then lower completed fertility. So the net effect is that they have the same or slightly lower completed fertility. So they are taking on quite a big cost. Even if you end up with the same number of children in evolutionary terms, you've maybe miscarried more, you've lost a number of children, you might have lost some children after birth. So even though you're net equal, it's a huge cost. It's a huge health cost to these individuals. And then the fourth takeaway is what I just said, which that potentially there's some modest fitness benefits that are accruing at the household level. The issue with this result, it could be because household level advantages like wealth consolidation and sort of denser kin networks that might be helpful for child rearing and things like that lead to higher household fertility. We still can't separate it from those households just having more traditional pronatalist norms in them. We are controlling for the neighborhood unobserved confounding, but there still could be a between household difference in characteristics. So we can't quite tease those apart, which is unfortunate because this is the most interesting result of that paper. And really, future work that I would like to do is look at a less coarse measure of inclusive fitness benefits. And I think I'll just need to collect my own data on that, because you need to track family that aren't in the same households. You need to be able to include neighborhoods where women are living right next to each other, but they're not in the same house, but they're all there, to really be able to tease this apart. But I think it's a interesting first result that has quite good avenue for continuing it. But that is the end. So if anyone has any questions or anything like that, I'd be happy to discuss.
So I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, and there are two issues I want to discuss with you.
Yeah, I'm actually just going to get a notepad.
So, first of all, my understanding is that Alison Shaw's research with Pakistani Muslims show that there's no recognition whatsoever about the costs, the survival costs of close cousin marriage. And so from a sociocultural anthropologist's perspective, one evaluates individual decision makers, and so this knowledge that you have, that all of us have about the costs of inbreeding depression is not shared by decision makers. But do they recognize that they have larger families because of earlier marriage and longer years of exposure to childbearing? Do they recognize that? Because apparently, from what I know, is there's really no clear understanding of the costs of inbreeding depression, because it's so small a difference, and it's among such a large population. So that's question number one. Question number two is in your paper number 1, some of the correlations between types of kinship systems and women's status might, from my perspective as a sociocultural anthropologist, might be due to spurious correlations, such as higher work in societies with patriarchality might not be due to the patriarchality so much as the kind of economic system in which patriarchality occurs. Because you had one slide with these sorts of correlations. So those are my two questions.
Yeah. So I think on the first one, certain about whether there is recognition amongst the individuals that they could have children with ill health. Yeah, it really varies. I know that in the in the UK context, for example, amongst the Pakistani communities, I mean, they like do understand. They just say it's God's will if they have children with it.
Alison just said they don't understand.
Yeah, and I mean, the British context is very different also because they're interacting with healthcare officials who give them like extra genetic testing and stuff like that. And also, like I've shown, it's a really rare event. So it's actually very difficult. It is very difficult to understand whether there is a cost. Also, my understanding of how kind of inbreeding depression works is that it can often get fixated. It gets fixed in sort of single lineages. So many lineages happily have a lot of cousin marriage with no observable negative consequences. So yes, certainly. Whereas it's very noticeable if they are marrying 6 months earlier. It's easy. And so if there is a desire for earlier marriage, that's really trackable. I guess, which is how I need to work on the framing of that paper, is that if you're just if I'm going to ask the question purely as a how does kin marriage evolve in humans or get maintained, then I suppose it doesn't matter whether they recognise that there are costs, that it shouldn't have emerged at the level it has among humans if there are considerable costs, if they have lower evolutionary fitness. The second question on that particular paper to do with that, a lot of it could be spurious. That particular one is done in an area of China where there's a lot of ethnic, it's same ethnic group, lots of kinship diversity and similar subsistence. So they're neighboring communities So you do get to control for a lot of the issues that you raised, like subsistence type and kind of, their economic system. And the argument is made that the only thing that differs between the two is their residence pattern. Yeah.
Yeah, great talk. I was just curious as to why you chose child mortality under 5 as like the signifier for potential genetic consequences of inbreeding.
Simply because it's the standard. In public health, you look at childhood mortality under 5 or infant mortality under 1. And that's just because mortality gets rarer as you age. So you're not going to pick up much extra after the age of 5. Yeah.
Going back to your slide in part 1 that showed the increase in Pakistani cousin marriages. From what I remember, seeing the graph, it looks like they started increasing from the 1950s onward. I'm curious if you'd be interested in kind of tracking how that relates to their gaining independence from Britain in 1947 as a possible mechanism for, or why it's being maintained in that area.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I haven't looked at it much. One important thing is that graph was birth cohort. So it was individuals born in 1950, but they're not going to reach marital age until 18 years later or whatever it is. So they're not. So when they're growing up, they're experiencing the end of the partition of India, but actually it's a decade on from that as well. Yeah.
So kind of following up on your discussion with Nancy a little bit, it strikes me that your premise, with which you sort of frame the entire enterprise, that it's common, so it must be functional, right? It is questionable on several grounds. So first of all, if you adopt a Spurgerian approach to cultural evolution, you can get things to be quite common across cultures because they resonate with some aspect of human psychology, right? Yeah. And not because they produce any benefits to the group or even to the individual, right? So, meat is about 7 times more likely to be tabooed around the world than other foodstuffs. Meat taboos, while they might have utility in terms of being ethnic markers and so on, they don't have any utility in terms of diet, and they're often dysfunctional. Colostrum wastage is really common around the world and is clearly dysfunctional, right? So I think it's a mistake to assume commonality is evidence of function either at the level of the individual or the level of the family or the level of the culture as a whole, okay? Secondly, even if there is functionality, it's not necessarily in terms of number of offspring produced, right? So you can get cultural group selection for practices that produce, enhanced technological advancement, wealth accumulation, agricultural intensification, and so on. Those can all be favored through cultural group selection, and they don't necessarily have to correlate with larger family size, right? So since some of the traditional explanations for cousin marriage having to do with avoiding the dissolution of land holdings across generations and maximizing wealth accumulation within families are pretty cogent by themselves. Those could be true, and you could still have lower levels of total reproductive success, right? That is, the two processes can operate in opposition and produce frequency across cultures if one is stronger than the other.
Yeah. I mostly agree with what you say. So, this doesn't really work because of the examples you gave on sort of food taboos and things like that. And so maybe as a weak answer, I do think that decisions decisions based on reproductive choices and marital choices, my behavioral ecology training just pushes me to think that they are so important in terms of the evolutionary behavior that they should be more resilient to things like Sperberian cultural attraction and things like that. The other thing about assuming functionality, I agree. And so, in a way, what I'm trying to test here is can we detect some functionality on various metrics? And what I settled on for this data, literally just driven by what you can test with that data, was evolutionary reproductive success. If it didn't find it, it didn't find it, and it found it it's a bit tenuous. I do think that the wealth-related function of it is going to be much more important, and I would theoretically assume that those wealth-related benefits then arguably at some point arguably did evolve because they translate to reproductive success. But actually, I think it would be much more useful and part of future work to actually just look at wealth-related function and not look at reproductive success, because I think the association there will be stronger. Did I miss something?
No, I don't think you missed anything. I mean, in part, this is a set of differences of opinion with regard to theoretical premises, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, my own approach would be that where natural selection has shaped human behavior in this regard, and Morocco's in your set there, right? It sent Westermarckian inbreeding avoidance mechanisms in the minds of individuals, right? So co-reared cousins may be averse to marriage because the mechanism is being triggered by the cues of relatedness that co-rearing provides. But cultural evolution can solve that problem by raising cousins separately, right? Or just through, parental coercion, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, one interesting thing related to that point that does sometimes come up in the ethnographic literature is because, well, especially if you're marrying a cousin that you've grown up with, where you might get that Westermarckian kind of trigger, is that sometimes the couples do express like difficulty in their sexual relationships because potentially that effect is that developmental thing is getting triggered, and they have inbreeding avoidance with that individual. But yes, I suppose it's just a theoretical kind of distinction. One project that I would really like to do, because also kind of in line with what you're saying, it's now predominantly occurring in the Middle East and North Africa, so that could just be cultural spread and have no function. One main hypothesis for why those areas have such high rates of cousin marriage is wealth related, and it's that Islamic law says women have to inherit. So you have this religious diktat that says, okay, these are otherwise mostly patrilineal groups, but now we're saying your daughters have to inherit. So they suddenly have a risk, if you obey that rule, of wealth escape, where women will take wealth from those families and take it to their unrelated husband. And one easy solution to that is cousin marriage, just fold that inheritance back in. And actually there is some genetic data that shows that you get this spike in cousin marriage kind of around the time of the advent of Islam and at the advent of those laws potentially being introduced. So what I would like to do is a kind of phylogenetic analysis of that area, looking at hypotheses like that, and then also controlling for just cultural spread and I guess cultural attraction somewhat.
In relation to this, in Western societies, cousin marriages are somewhat taboo. Can you explain why, given what you have found?
I've actually, to my shame, never actually looked at why you get this transition to a taboo of cousin marriage in Western societies. Obviously, it was once very common and there was no taboo. and that was quite recently as well. So I don't really know what changed. There is actually slightly related to that, which is kind of Joe Henrich's work, and Jonathan Schultz, who's an economist, is they say that the Western Christian Church, at a date that I can't remember, banned cousin marriage in Western Europe. So you have this other religious law coming in, and that was because the church didn't like the power of these landed families, and they wanted to break down the power of those families. So they said, okay, you can't marry your cousins anymore. And they provide evidence that it did result in lower cousin marriage, which could then lead to loss of that preference, and that also it's responsible for the weird psychology, so that Westerners are particularly non-conformist and individualistic compared to non-Western educated industrialized nations. And they make the case that when you force those kin networks to break down, you force individuals to form relationships with unrelated individuals, and that generates a whole different kind of pattern of psychological traits. But so that would be their argument. Yeah.
This is also interesting, thank you. I was wondering if maybe the the effects on under 5 mortality might be different in cases where the inbreeding depression of health are like maybe less compared to the, sorry, I'm not sure what I'm saying. In cases where sort of other factors that contributed to child mortality are stronger, would that change the trade-off? And is there some way that you can?
So interestingly, I have interacted it with wealth. So obviously poor households have different pressures on under 5 mortality. And what you find actually is slight evidence that the coefficient gets stronger in higher wealth households because more of the variation in childhood mortality is being explained by inbreeding costs, because less is being explained by access to healthcare. So you do see a difference, and an interesting one that speaks to that. Yeah.
Thank you. So I can choose which question I want to ask. This is all super fun to think about. So maybe leading off of that last question, I'm wondering if you have information on under a different age mortality. Could you titrate that down?
Yeah, I can do infant.
Yeah, you could. And the reason I asked that question is because with inbreeding depression and considering infant mortality under 5, it kind of gets to what you were saying about access to healthcare and incorporating wealth, in the sense that infectious disease mortality is, I think, more part of that under 5, but also if you lowered it, you also might get more at negative genetic effects of consanguineous marriage that are absent of infectious disease exposure.
Okay, yeah.
Because, right, those are kind of, that might be something
right.
more to the point of what you're thinking about with respect to genetic effects, negative effects on health with respect to genetic inbreeding.
Yeah.
And I don't suppose you have information on like miscarriage.
No, I actually do.
You do?
Yeah, I do.
Because that then would be even better.
Yeah, so the miscarriage...
Or maybe not better, but in addition to.
So I can look at miscarriages. The different survey years do it differently. So the only way you can do it across the whole sample is by lumping everything in together, which is miscarriage, stillbirth, and induced abortion.
Okay, but that all seems
Yeah, the induced abortion, I'm a bit like,
it's
a little different, but actually you can make the case that a lot of induced abortions are because there's a problem with the child.
Yes.
Yeah, and so they do have higher rates of miscarriage. Yeah.
That could perhaps build out that
Yeah.
idea a bit more. Okay, and then I want to ask one more question.
Yeah.
Can I go back to your first study for a second?
Yes.
I was actually curious, this is just sort of a curiosity, so you controlled for effects of different things, like father's male educate, I don't know,
Yeah,
am I
husband's
calling it
education.
father, saying father, yeah.
Yeah.
Husband's education, age of marriage, and I was wondering if if any of those covariates, if the effect sizes of those covariates are, I was just curious what the effects of those covariates were. And I don't feel, thank you. Thank you. Yeah,
So sorry, it's small.
there it is.
No, often they're much larger.
Yeah,
much
that's what I
larger.
was
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they're not. It's just too busy to put it in a slide. But yes. So, the respondents' education is at the top. So, complete secondary and higher education much less likely to report intimate partner violence, and then husbands as well. Complete secondary, means that the women are less likely. That's while controlling for household wealth, so those are obviously collinear. And ignore that there's no association with age and year of birth. That's a function of the fixed effects. If you take away the fixed effects, then they become significant because it's just there's no variation. Yeah. So they're bigger. Yeah.
We have one question from Zoom. I don't know whether, I asked her to type that out. Let me see if I could. Patricia, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Maybe just unmute her on the big screen.
Okay.
Or
Here?
here, I'll do it.
Okay.
So kind of just in response to the last question said that more highly educated spouses or couples, there's less partner violence. But it seems like can you hear me?
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
It seems like from your very large sample size that you gave written surveys and maybe even online surveys, which would have restricted the range of both wealth and education. You wouldn't have had any very low education or subsistence villagers who had no opportunity or very little opportunity for education in the sample. So it seems like you might have had a restricted range socioeconomically and educationally. So I was just wondering if that is the case, and if so, it would lead to an underestimate of the positives and the negatives. The positives being in the first part, partner violence, and the negatives being in child mortality.
Yeah, okay, now I'm lost. Sorry. Second. So the sample, which is, so the reason that there's no significance on some of the lower education levels there is actually also a function of the fixed effects. It's because there's not enough variation within those communities for you to get it out. But if I take it away, then you would get significance across all of those. The DHS, though, I didn't administer it. They're huge surveys run by USAID, and they work based off of the census, and they are nationally representative. So they actually do try and get data from very poor communities up to very rich ones, and try and make it representative. So no, it's pretty good. It's very good for that. Oh wait, now I can't hear again. Do I have to turn it up here? If I turn it up here, will I hear? Wait, I didn't hear you, but I did. It's on, but it's not coming out. Oh, turn up.
I was asking if AID people actually go to these poor communities and interview them in person rather than having them do a written survey?
I missed the first part of that because I couldn't, the volume wasn't working.
Oh dear. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can hear you,
Yeah, I'm closer to the microphone. I was wondering whether the AID survey that for poor communities with people who couldn't do a written survey because of low education or no education, whether they actually go to those communities and interview them in person.
Yeah, it's all interviewed with trained interviewees. Yeah, and they read out the questions. They do it in multiple different languages. So it's sort of the sort of like highest bar you can get on a survey, actually.
That sounds really great.
Yeah.
I have a second question. Do I have time or no?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So your conclusion about the evolutionary puzzle, since now there's, you might say, a historical movement towards increasing rejection of cousin marriage, is it that back in the day under less technological, educational, and lower economic conditions, the mother's welfare was more important, and now under increased economic conditions and increased education, increased technology, is it that the baby, the child's survival is more important? Is that the answer to the evolutionary question, that cultural evolution has had an effect?
So the question for everyone that didn't hear, which is pretty much everyone, I think. So does the sort of like change in economic development mean that you weight the mother's health? How do you weight the mother versus the child's health? And whether that would change things?
Well, there has been a change, because at the beginning you talked about how currently in many parts of the world, including the United States, there's a rejection of cousin marriage. Could that be because under our ecological conditions we consider, and therefore cultural conditions, we consider the child's health more important than the mother's, whereas under other conditions that were more prevalent years ago, the mother's condition was considered more important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one issue with that is that I don't necessarily see them as particularly distinct. So if you're going to miscarry or have infant mortality, that's obviously, and therefore you need to compensate for those pregnancies by having more pregnancies. That's obviously very dangerous to maternal health. So I think they're much more correlated than that. In terms of if what you're asking is why there's a backlash against kind of cousin marriage in Western countries, I think it's being driven mostly by the fact that the communities that are practicing cousin marriage are predominantly immigrant communities, and it's related to the anti-immigrant sentiment, and related to kind of an idea of the perfect immigrant being the integrated immigrant. So if you're marrying your cousins and you're only marrying within your community, that's a very like visual symbol of lack of integration within, I don't know, the white population. So that's kind of what's driving the debates certainly in the British Parliament about it.
Roberto, can you come to coffee to ask your question, or do you guys get it right afterwards? Okay. Thank you so much.